Yeah.
Okay, let's kick this thing off. So this is the April lecture in the Fundamental Problems and Core Concepts here at Theory Underground. What's up, everybody? New angle on the camera. Instead of having it like way over there, it's kind of coming at me slant. I thought maybe that'll look a little bit better. So it's because I can see you all right here, right now. Now, a couple of days ago, I tried to do this lecture with nobody present, and it felt too weird. I still really appreciate to have people present. And so we've got Sam, Spencer, and Ann here. And so uh, the goal was to do this specifically with the programming crew at TU. I did not extend the invitation to the people who are on the payroll, who are full-time students right now, because this is finals week. And at the end of the day, they're kind of like in it for a very basic set of tasks, whereas the TU programming crew, which is currently in its gestial form, it's like baby crew, which really started with Darren Large, uh, is something that I think is probably a little bit more here for the vision pitch or theory side of things. And then if it's worth referencing or sharing with Alexander and Addie, we can do so later. But also, you as programmers, I think you will be better at knowing what to refer them to, because there's so much content at TU that does relate to the actual stuff that we want to do with the website, with the app, uh, with eventually video games, with all kinds of things. But
Hmm.
but for very busy people who are just trying to address specific problems, that's like a whole other thing. And so that's like theory, right? And I kind of don't want to make people feel like they have to be here, which is a great uh, sort of segue into the theme here, which is when to really be a part of a community, like when should you feel the need to show up? And should you ever, when it's something like what we're doing? Because there's this part of me that wants to say no one should ever feel the need to show up for anything going on here, because Theory Underground is trying to tailor its content towards workers with earbuds. And workers with earbuds have a lot of different kinds of contexts that they're in, and schedules, modes of life that make it so it's really hard to be somewhere in a routine way on a Zoom call, right? Not only that, but if we're doing something on a Sunday, we've got people who go to church. Uh, so there's a lot of different reasons why a person might not attend something if it's live. And at the same time, that could start to feel like you're missing out, right? And it could start to feel like there's like this sort of super egoic um, pressure to go. And I don't like that either, right? I don't like that at all. So that's one of the things that we've been experimenting with, and that I kind of want to navigate out of. I want it to be less super egoic. And at the same time, we're thinking about changes to the website and the priorities of things with the website. And so there's a lot of features. Every feature costs money, time, energy, effort. It requires real people doing things, right? I think that there's a very utopian version of myself 10 years ago, before I knew anything about programming, that was just kind of like, why don't we have this? Why don't we have that? You know, it's like everything seems like it could be fixed so easily. And it's like, well, because every single thing that you don't like or that could be better on the internet requires paying a team of people to make it happen. Or if it's open source or volunteer based, that's coming from somebody's precious time and energy, right? And so what I want to do later is talk about the features, and we'll do that as a discussion. But right now, it's the fundamental problems and core concepts. And so the fundamental problem that I want to start out with is humans suck. Humans suck. Also, we love them. and we want to defend the human, and we want to build the conditions of possibility for the human to exist. Okay? So we want to go from humans suck to humans rock, right? That's what we want. We want to go from humans suck to humans rock. And of course, it'll always be both. But part of the whole thing with critical media theory, CMT, especially over the last couple of years, is thinking about not the technology's effects on us, but the medium's effects on us. Now, the technology for the medium today includes cables underneath the ocean. It includes satellites up in space. Like, that's the technological apparatus. But the medium is the part that mediates for consciousness, right? It mediates for your sensory apparatus, your central nervous system, right? And so Marshall McLuhan and Lewis Mumford are the sort of OG media theorists who think about this, right? And of course, the go-to saying is the medium is the message, which is to say form in a sort of way matters more than content, or form selects for certain kinds of content. And if the form, which is to say the medium, is our environment, or shapes our environment and our relations to it, then in a way we are the content of that form, how it molds us and our behavior, right? And so I'm going to be very crass and skip over a lot. For people like Sam who are very new here, I just want to say, and I don't know how new you might be at Theory Underground. Maybe you have heard me say this before, but it's worth reiterating. It goes like this. If we're going to say that the medium is the message, okay, then we'll have a speech bubble coming from the medium. And I'll start out with, for Marshall McLuhan, to give you an example of what he's getting at. He thinks, the Gutenberg revolution and going to the printing press, and then the telegraph, the newspaper, this laid the conditions for nationalism, right? One of the things people often will say is that Marxism underestimated nationalism in the 20th century. And it was easy to underestimate it because it was such a new thing, right? They were fish in water. It was easy to not take it too seriously because it hadn't really calcified into the sort of monstrous sort of reality that it became in the 20th century. So nation states became a really big deal. And of course, someone like Mussolini or Hitler or Stalin, all of them became realists about the nation and about its efficacy, the efficacy of organizing on that basis, as opposed to an international basis, right? It became easy to focus on this sort of nationalism idea, the mythos. But Marshall McLuhan will say that's because of the newspaper, because everyone was reading the newspaper. This was something that comes from that. And I think that this is something that that book, Imaginary Communities or Imagined Communities, that book runs with as well. Okay, but for Marshall McLuhan, he's looking beyond that, right? At the point that he's intervening, we're beyond just radio. The medium has evolved to television. And so what he thinks is that we're entering a post-literate age. He's been pretty much proven correct on that, right? So we're moving towards a post-literate age. Of course, people can read stop signs and a how-to manual if they need to. But for the most part, we are beyond the time when regular working people were reading the King James Bible and Pilgrim's Progress, and Marx was able to write in the way that he writes in newspapers, which is something that Spencer Leonard was talking about when we were all at the bar at the Platypus Convention. He was talking about how, workers used to read the Marx's writing in the newspaper. They'd read it on the shop floor, right? And everyone's listening to it while it's being read. So workers with the earbuds, there is a precedent. This was already happening in a sort of sense, right? Which is exciting. And we'll come back to that theme in a little bit. But Marshall McLuhan thought that the medium, with TV in particular, was going to lead to a post-literate age where people are less desensitized and united. More united, less desensitized. And so we're talking about the global village he thought we were entering. An era of the global village. So I have to say something really quick about his theory of why he thought it was that we were going to be less desensitized. And so I'll use a real easy example. You don't have to understand anything about politics, history, economics, just war theory, philosophy, sociology, nothing. You don't need to have any understanding in any of these fields to see videos of babies being blown to bits or parents holding them crying on your phone and react strongly, right? Like, so Hannah, the lone flag woman who came and talked to us on the steps of the Capitol, she makes sense in this sort of way that Marshall McLuhan is thinking. Also, he's thinking about the age of television, right? This is when Vietnam is being shown and it's sensational. It's on TV. And it makes some people, enough people to turn out in numbers, come out for anti-war protests, right? It was a big deal. And that wouldn't have been possible, and it wouldn't have happened the same way had it not been for the medium collapsing space and time and giving people this sort of direct voyeuristic sort of access to what was going on the ground in the war. So this unites us. But the desensitization part, what he's thinking about is how every medium enhances one sense or a couple of senses while numbing other senses. And so bookish people, you know, we have certain senses heightened while other senses are being numbed, which means that the ratio of our sensory apparatus is off kilter from primitive people who just live in the world and are living in there like more or less unmediated. Now, of course, we can use Kant's categories or the dogmatic image of thought in Deleuze-Guattari. We could always critique this idea of an unmediated sense perception. Husserl would be good for that as well. Of course, everything's always mediated by the categories of the mind, by the dogmatic image of thought, by something like intentionality. We reflect on things. There's all of this other stuff between the things themselves and our direct apprehension of those things. But obviously also human beings, insofar as human beings exist, say in the jungle or out in the Midwest of the United States 1,000 years ago, it's unmediated in the sense of like elaborate kind of technological devices that are going to heighten certain senses while numbing other ones. So that's what he's getting at. And what he's saying is that bookish people are desensitized in the way that you're able to read the newspaper and it's telling you about something terrible that's going on or some kind of a decision that has to be made, right? It becomes easy for someone like Winston Churchill to sit there and read about people in India and then write about how he considers them to be cockroaches, right? The distance and the numbing, it makes it easy to be in this sort of analytic frame of mind. And if you watched the sensational Joe Rogan episode that happened recently, which I only saw the first hour of because it's the part that everyone talks about, where the guy who's a big defender of Israel, Douglas Murray, is on with that guy named Josh, who's a podcaster who is just kind of into history, right? He's a comedian, but he also likes to do stuff related to history. Well, I mean, I don't want to open a can of worms here, but you guys saw it or you guys know about this? And you don't know anything about it? Well, a lot of people won't have known anything about it because a lot of you are diligently avoiding everything viral, right? Great job. But this was particularly sensational because Douglas Murray's been this huge advocate for Israel. He thinks the biggest problem in the world right now is anti-Semitism. He's not really worried about Palestine, right? And he comes on to talk to this guy, Joe, and just out the door starts talking about how the podcasters keep talking about things that they're not experts on. And Joe, why don't you bring experts on who really know about what's going on, people who've really been there? And then, this guy, he keeps kind of referring to the other person he's supposed to be sort of in dialogue with as like, who's this guy? Why is this guy here? Why should I even take him seriously? He's not an expert. And that guy's like, what? I'm not allowed to talk about it? Right? Like what? And he's like, have you been there? Douglas Murray's like, have you been there? And then of course everyone goes crazy because this is a podcast. And so it's like, this is So he's coming on to basically say the podcast is irrelevant, or at least the job of the podcast should be to platform experts. And of course, there's all kinds of reasons why people will think that's ridiculous. Though in some cases, maybe he has a point. Okay, so that's the whole sensational thing. Well, Piers Morgan, who's even more sensational, of course, brings back on that Josh guy and then some other guy who's going to defend Israel right now, and then kind of eggs them both on, gets them going. And so this is where I'm like, okay. The way that this ties in with McLuhan and how desensitized he thinks bookish people are is that in the case of Douglas Murray making appeals to experts, or in the case of this legal expert that Piers Morgan brings on to talk to the guy who's anti-war and just super against what's going on, Israel against Palestine right now, is that Josh, like Hannah, the flag woman who came to us on the Capitol steps and filibustered our event, Josh is just not only devastated, but also like morally offended and put off by the idea that he should have to understand some kind of a theory to make sense of this. He's like, I don't care if you're saying that it's legal. I don't care if you're saying that it's justified by just war theory. It's wrong. We can see that it's wrong. That's what Marshall McLuhan is getting at, is that once you remove the kind of education and literacy that built up Western civilization, once you kind of remove it, it becomes a little harder to justify certain things. Because now the images and the sounds allow this instant feeling reaction, right? You're not reading about it, you're seeing it. Okay, but what happened? Though it's true that we are in a post-literate world, and that, as Neil Postman will also then go on to argue, we've pretty much replaced thoughtful opinions with feelings usually associated with images, whether those be brands or babies with their heads blown off. That is the fact. We have more or less gone there. We're obviously not in the global village, and that will be something that Neil Postman and Jean Baudrillard are both very clear about, right? We're not in a global village. In fact, we're completely fractured. We're completely fractured. And then, of course, that brings in the whole thesis of the post-class fractured mass, right? Okay. We're not able to get on the same wavelength anymore. There's not a zeitgeist of the nation, right? The closest thing we've ever come to a zeitgeist of the nation would have been everyone being down in the dumps and anxious about COVID, right? Like you could kind of feel it in the air, but also there were plenty of people living their lives without any reference to that, more or less. Okay. So we're not in the global village. So Marshall McLuhan was thinking that this sort of post-literate, more emotional, communal global village effect was going to be the message of television, the underlying subtext that would change our environment and therefore change us. But he wasn't a utopian. He was thinking we would have to develop our media literacy and actively harness the changes in technology. And obviously we did not do that. The people who've harnessed it are not doing it for any such purposes, right? And so we can always talk about the political economic reasons for why that's happening. And of course we should, and McLuhan never goes far enough. He's not critical enough, right? But now we're in a different situation. We've replaced the television with the smartphone. And the message of the medium, the shorthand for it, is faster. In fact, instant. I'm just going to use the word instant here. Instant, or presentism would be another way of talking about this. Instantaneity is another way of talking about this, right? Instantaneity. But Neil Postman, in Amusing Ourselves to Death, is going to talk about this in the context of the now thisification of television, because he's writing in the 80s, when they say, it's very likely that we're about to enter a nuclear war. Now this. And then it's something completely unrelated. And then they go, and now this, and it's a Burger King commercial, And the point is, nothing is connected, everything is leveled, and even if something's really bad, you don't have time to think about it before you're on to the next thing, right? Because if you say that we're very likely about to have a nuclear war, or if you say we just dropped nukes on Japan. Okay, now this Burger King commercial. Well, come on. In reality, if it's real news, people should have to sit with it for a little while, right? You would say we're gonna just have silent airtime for the next 15 minutes so that we as a nation can sit with this reality, right? That's not what happens, obviously. That's not what happens at all. So it's the churn of the now this. But another way we've been talking about the message of the medium today is to say TMI plus FOMO equals ADHD. And so ADHD here, of course, is a metonym for a culture of distraction. It's not a clinical term. FOMO is obviously just fear of missing out. TMI is not to say people are oversharing. That's the normal usage of the word. That's not how it's being used in this formula. The way we're using TMI here is to say, in the information age, there's too much information. People have way too much information and images bombarding them every day, but no concepts or theory for organizing the chaos. Much less, I mean, if you have a sort of basis in the life of the mind in the different fields, then you might have an idea about where to look for things, right? But instead, people are just out here. It's the wild, wild west still, even though, of course, it's a wild, wild west that's been captured by corporations, right? It's TMI plus FOMO. So we have way too much information, no way of organizing the chaos of it. There's also a fear of missing out. You got to keep up with the Joneses. If you get off of Instagram for a little while, you'll realize you're way out of the loop. You feel out of the loop, even though if you get back into the usage of Instagram, whose wavelength are you being looped in on? Like maybe a couple friends where you share reels back and forth, but in reality, how many people really share? But it's feeling like you're a part of something, right? Feeling like you're a part of something because everyone checks it. Okay. So the too much information plus the fear of missing out results in this culture of constant distraction. And the now this ification, the instantaneity, and the sort of emphasis on me, right? If Christopher Lasch was talking about the culture of narcissism in the 1980s, well, or he's writing about it in the 80s and he's talking about the new left in the 70s specifically, right? At the time that all these radicals started really turning inward and just trying to balance their chi or whatever. Like that's, there was this whole move where like the radicals were like, let's take the long march through the institutions and have the revolution of the self, which meant like listen to Ram Dass and Alan Watts, like that's kind of what Christopher Lasch is getting at with the culture of narcissism, right? Everything becomes about the salt baths that you're taking and calling that radical. That wasn't something that got invented in 2020. It was something Christopher Lasch was talking about in the 80s, which is amazing. But the reason I bring it up is because this me, we could call that the culture of narcissism. This, me, gets to this sort of fragmentation where the only center to anything, the only point of continuity is sort of whatever you're curious about in the moment. And then, of course, that is the term that is our segue into the vicious cycle. And the vicious cycle is between ambiguity, non-committal curiosity, which obviously most people's relationship to the newspaper was even that way. This is why this whole dynamic I'm talking about comes from Kierkegaard before it gets picked up by Heidegger later. So this cycle, this vicious cycle between ambiguity, non-committal curiosity, and idle chatter, chit-chat, right? Which is like we could call that non-committed, ambiguous superficial conversations. They're not deliberate. There's no real risk. There's no real stakes. Nothing really hinges on it, right? Now, I'm moralizing it a little bit more than Heidegger would, though I think Kierkegaard is going to moralize it a little bit because it's a bad thing if you never get out of it. But the good thing about it is that knowing that we find ourselves here when whether you're a teenager, 25, 35, 45, at the point that you want to get serious about life, you're going to realize, oh, yeah, why is this so ubiquitous? Everywhere I go, it's this sort of ambiguous, non-committal, curiously, like idle chit chat. Like what is that? Well, the good news is that that's a springboard to deliberate conversations, right? We know that they're possible because we realize we're having, it's like non-committal is the precondition for commitment, right? Ambiguity is the precondition for clarity. And idle chatter is the precondition for more genuine forms of discourse that try to get to the root of things. Right. So the message of the medium then is this sort of instantaneous onslaught of TMI, FOMO, ADHD, now this, me, and it's all in the churn of ambiguity, non-committal curiosity, and idle chatter. This is where we find ourselves. Of course, if you are listening to this, you've done a lot to try to correct against that situation. You've done a lot to try to harness the better tendencies of the medium that will hopefully help you lift yourself up by your bootstraps, so to speak, towards some higher capacities that you have, right? If you are affiliated with us, you're trying to make something of your life and you're trying to learn. You're not just being entertained, but also we are human and humans suck. And we are having a suck effect on us, actually. And it's our time, it's our energy, and it's our attention being vacuumed away, right? This is why Nance and I talk about the rainbow vacuum cleaner at the end of history being this sort of, it's just sucking everything away into this churn that we're talking about, right? And we say rainbow vacuum cleaner because it was, those were something door-to-door salesmen used to try to sell between the 90s and 2010s. And, they're very high quality, but they cost thousands of dollars, right? Most commodities only have exchange value or sign value determining them. But then there's always like those super, super expensive products that are like really, really good quality. But like what you're really being sold there is debt, right? And that's what the door-to-door salesman is selling you with the rainbow vacuum cleaner. It's like it's a pure use value, but it's so expensive. What they're really selling you is the debt. And the idea is like everything else is waste, everything else is being reduced to waste, but some things are very valuable, but really you just have to go into so much debt to get those. And so there you go, the rainbow vacuum at the end of history, sucking away your time, energy, and attention. Just, you don't get to have it. Okay. That's basically a speed run of the critical media theory course where I'm honing in on the threads that have really stuck with me and proven the most useful. This vicious cycle, we always talk about it in reference to solitude and solicitude, genuine time with self, genuine time with others, two things that are interdependent, but when you don't have the time energy to ground out with yourself or ground out with other people, because we live in a job-centric society that's sucking away all your time energy, right? The virtuous circle between solitude and solicitude collapses, and all you have left is this vicious cycle. So we find ourselves here on the internet, using our phones, laptops, and desktop computers to access Theory Underground, to try to work together, to read books together, to think about great thinkers and big concepts and these fundamental contradictions that shape the trajectory of intellectual life and the ways that we can relate to the world today. And we do so not just because we're like, oh, kids are on their phones too much today. Nobody's really talking. That is a sort of caricature of us. Like if people want to make fun of Theory Underground and its focus on the medium or CMT, they'll go there. That's not the point, right? The point is we're going to be realists about the post-class fractured mass. We're going to be realists about this being what we're working against. And then nevertheless, we're going to do something awesome, right? And there's a lot of things we've already done that are awesome, but there's a lot more room for growth. There's a lot more room for growth. So much more room for growth. We've learned this on the tours that we've done. We've learned this on these 12 to 17 hour epic marathon streams that we've done, over 15 of those at this point in the last year and a half, right? Like doing wild experiments that push the limits, or self-funding a tour like out of our back pockets and just stretching ourselves super thin so that we can actually go and get in the meat space with people. All of these things are experiments with the medium and what we can do with it to get outside of just being passive consumers or recipients of information, or the kinds of creators who start producing and then get audience captured, right? And that audience capture issue is one of the 3 A's in the 3 crises that Theory Underground comes out as a response to. 3 kinds of burnout. The burnout of the attention economy, the burnout of the academic situations, what did you say, academia, and the burnout of activism, right? So these are the 3 A's. Now, those are not the most fundamental crises today. Those are just the crises where it's likely if you're involved with Theory Underground, you burnt out in one, if not all of those 3 spheres of life, right? You burnt out with activism, you burnt out with academia, you burnt out with the attention economy. You don't want to be an influencer, or you don't want to be a follower. You want to be an active participant who's taking charge in your own life, who's learning how to think and talk and read and write, right? Like that's the goal here. And I think that's what unites everybody. But how do we get there? Do we get there on Discord? Personally, I liked the message board we used to have on the old website a lot more. But even that had its flaws, right? It still felt obligatory, and it still felt like TMI. It still felt like there was a fear of missing out, right? So for people who don't know, I spent the first 6 months, and Anne, I'm about to call on you to share a little bit about this, but like the first 6 months of Theory Underground, I spent building a website and then app, right? And we moved to Mexico, and I used up all of my savings so that I could focus on doing that. And I was doing it myself. You have to understand, I'm not a techie person. So I was at my complete wit's end because I'd worked with a lot of programming volunteers. And the fact is when you work with a programmer and they're doing it as a volunteer activity, or you're paying them, but you're not paying them enough, the fact is they have to work elsewhere as well. And where they have to work more and where pays them more is going to demand more of their attention. And then they're going to be exhausted most of the time. And they're not going to be able to get things done when I need it. And sometimes it could take 3 months. And it's 3 months of trial and error and bugs. And it's because they're doing the work that would require a real team of people, right? And so I'd given up after multiple attempts over the last 10 years to do various things with programmers. And I was like, I'm just going to do it myself. I have to learn how to do everything myself. And so I spent those 6 months in Mexico building up a website that worked. And the idea was a course gated, I'm going to go over here, course gated forum based site / app. And this idea of course gatedness was a way of trying to counter the medium and certain tendencies in it. The idea is you should be able, and so actually, hold on. I got to add the word social media. Course gated forum based social media site app. We were really excited about this. I was very proud of it. We almost had it working. We were almost there. And the idea was people are going to have a space in which maybe it's like a public forum. They're able to engage for free or just generally. But if you want to go deeper into certain topics that there are courses on, you are expected to do the course before engaging in that topic. You want to talk about sex and gender? Do the course on sex and gender before we have that conversation. You have to know most of us disagree on all these issues, and many of us are politically incorrect and would be canceled for our opinions in most leftist spaces. Like, you have to know. We can talk about this theoretically, but you also have to know there's a bunch of different kind of viewpoints. And by going through the course, you'll be able to understand what kinds of ideas are on the table, what kinds of texts people have read. There'll be a sort of miniature canon for people to refer to for that conversation. And then later on, we can always bring back another course or another instantiation of that course with a visiting professor or a whole crew of visiting professors, or we can have a seminar where we're all reading some new text or whatever that relates to this topic. And I use that as an example, but of course we would also want to have a devoted forum to being in time. So you could be joining 5 years after the first Being in Time course, but because you do the Being in Time course, now you're able to participate in the forum. There is even the idea that you go chapter by chapter, lecture by lecture, and you have to respond to certain prompts, almost like these are homework assignments. But then once you've responded to those prompts, you're
You lost. We can't hear you anymore. You just cut out.
back.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. How long ago did I cut out?
It was like 5 seconds.
Yeah, 5 seconds ago.
Okay. It would have broken my heart if you said 5 minutes ago. You're like, yeah, we thought you were just playing and pantomiming. So yeah, let's just say that you are taking the Being in Time course 5 years after the fact. The functionality, this is one of those features that costs money and you have to pay a programmer to do it, but it's genius and nobody else is doing it on the internet. Instead of throwing you into the Being in Time course forum and you just instantly have access to the whole backlog of all of the posts, you instead get slowly graduated into it, because each chapter, each lecture, as you go, there are certain questions that you're asked to reflect on and certain passages that you're asked to interpret. And then when you click submit, it doesn't just go to me, it actually shows up as a reply or a comment within a post in that forum. And so then people in that forum who have the notifications on for it will see, oh, there's new activity on this book. And then it loops them back in on the book that they might want to be reminded about. Because for me, for instance, that's one of those books that I want to go back to all the time. Das Kapital, all 3 volumes. Come on, it should be one forum for all of the political and economic works by Marx. And then, of course, there's the expansion packs. There's all kinds of capital expansion packs that also should be brought in on it, right? Well, you throw people in the deep end and just throw them into the forum and then they have a million posts to go through? No. By taking the course, they get graduated into a bunch of ongoing conversations, but they don't get to see what everyone else has said in response to X, Y, or Z prompts until they've filled out their responses, right? Like, that's what we were going for with the course-gated, forum-based social media site and app. We wanted to get away from this sense of TMI, FOMO, ADHD, now this, me, ambiguity, non-committal curiosity, idle chatter. We want to get away from all of this. We want to get away from the attention economy, academia, and activist kinds of traps that currently exist and create some kind of a new situation. Instead, we're on fucking Discord right now. And Discord encourages certain dynamics. Instantaneity is a perfect example. And so what I have up here is synchronic instantaneity, right? And this is just a term I'm using for the idea of you're always with everyone else. You're always with everyone else in a way where you expect constant feedback. think of a group chat that goes on forever and everyone's like going. Eventually it dies out. Eventually stuff comes up in enough people's lives in that group chat that it fizzles out. And then maybe it gets going again, but usually that turns out to have been a phase of your life. Usually that group chat becomes dead and, maybe eventually someone leaves it. Maybe a year later someone shares an image. Rarely does it keep going. Usually what happens is like one person starts sharing reels in there all the time. And then it's just like no one else is liking or reacting to them. And it's like, what happened? The flame has gone out. And no one knows how to deal with it. So synchronic instantaneity is sort of what I'm getting at with the idea of being live all the time. Constant access. Zoom calls create this sort of situation where during a certain time of the week or month, we get to experience it. Because right now, Spencer could interject. He could be like, wait, what was that? Okay, well, if we were on the other side and it was on-demand content, he can't do that, can he? Right, so we're going to put over here on demand. Spencer cannot simply interject because it's pre-recorded. This lecture we're doing right here is pre-recorded, but because Spencer, Sam, and Ann are present, obviously they could interject. So there is this sort of sense of synchronic instantaneity, right? Whereas Darren and or anyone else who's going to be watching this after the fact, obviously they can't, right? But on-demand content, you can still respond to it. In fact, you can think about it deeply and then respond later. That's like the whole idea of the course-gated, forum-based social media site and app, right? What we've been doing, though, has required a lot more of this obligatory, super egoic, you have to kind of be there on a weekly basis. And I don't like it. I don't like it because theory is something most of us are doing as a form of rebellion against our jobs or our other responsibilities. And so theory is something that we do in sort of like a different kind of super egoic enjoyment, right? It's the kind of rebellious streak, using super ego more in a Žižekian sense, where it's like the big other is over here telling you, you have to focus on your job. You have to focus on your friends and family. You have to focus on, and then there's this part of you that's like, this super egoic, like, no, I'm going to enjoy. I'm going to fucking have some form of inherent transgression. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go do this though. And so theory becomes the thing that we do to cheat at life, right? Like it's fun. We do it because we're passionate about it, because we're excited about it, or at least in the early days, we're curious about it. Well, what I think is happening though, with too much stuff happening over Zoom, is people get this sense that they have to be present and then they have to perform being interested in the lecture, which is different than just listening to the lecture. If you're just listening to the lecture while you're multitasking and doing a bunch of other things, the way you do with everything else at Theory Underground and the way you do with everything else in the rest of the world most of the time when it comes to your phone, that's fine because you can pause it, you can go back, you can speed forward, you can do all kinds of things when it's on demand, right? But we also want to have conversations. And so what I think has been happening for the last year especially is that there's been too many live lectures where people feel obligated to be present, and then it feels weird if you've not been there for a while. When in reality, we don't really give a shit. Like, we want you to enjoy it, and we want you to do it when you have the time to do it. But we also want you to be able to feel like you're part of the conversation. And the conversation is supposed to leak out into the forums on Discord, but it kind of doesn't really happen because Discord kind of sucks for facilitating the kinds of dynamics that we want. And there's not enough time and there's too few people talking or for talking at the end of a lecture. So it's like, a lecture or a seminar happens, and then what happens? A few people get to talk, maybe a couple. And usually it's like they're asking questions of the person who just gave the lecture. And that's great. And it's been amazing. And I think that there's really good things that come from that. But it's also different than if there was an on-demand lecture and then we had a couple of spontaneous conversations come off from that, as well as a couple of planned conversations. So for instance, I could see saying on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month, I'm going to do something at a certain time. Where I could say, I'll do a Tuesday, 2 p.m., I'll do a Friday, whatever. The point is like I try to like set up different times and days across the month so that Sam, Spencer, Ann, or anyone else is able to look at the schedule and go, I can make that one work. I'll watch the lecture on my own time, and then I'll come prepared to talk about it. And I might even do a little bit more reading in preparation, right? You might even do a reflection ahead of time and share that on the Discord or in the eventually, hopefully, the forum, right? This allows for much deeper thinking and much deeper engagement. It also would work for smaller groups, right? So let's just say that Benjamin, Nina, Mikey, me, anyone teaching at Theory Underground is doing a lot more on-demand content on their own time, and then everyone else is watching it on their own time, but then hosting multiple discussions for it where the people who are coming, it's probably going to be smaller groups, but it's more focused. And that might mean for me, for instance, I would like to actually go over a passage from the book I was quoting, right? I was talking about now this. There's really great passages. And in the first version of this lecture that I did earlier in the week, I actually read like 2 pages of that. Well, that's the kind of thing that I would do to go deeper in the discussion with people who watch the lecture. That way the lectures can stay shorter, on task, and ultimately, I think, bring people in together. Okay, that would mean more discussions and also probably more enjoyable access to the content. Last thing I want to say is that I asked my students yesterday and then today in my 2 classes at Boise State to do little reflections where I had planning on the top, spontaneity on the bottom, live on the left, and on demand on the right. And I said, I want you to think about your media habits, whether you're on TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, whatever it is. How much of the stuff that you do on your phone is planned outside of, say, online classes? Outside of online classes, how much of the stuff that you do on your phone is planned? And how much of it is spontaneous? How much of it is on demand? How much of it is live? Everybody is saying spontaneous and on demand. Everybody's saying that. Nobody's fucking using their phones to show up for scheduled things unless it's being forced by a job or by a class that probably sucks ass anyway. Okay? And I mean, they're literally like doing it for the degree. Online classes are historically bad, right? Notoriously bad. Like people don't tend to like their online classes at the university. So I think Theory Underground probably needs to do some experiments to correct against this habit where we are swimming upstream trying to get people to do way too much planning for TU. I don't want you to be doing planning. I want you to be doing binging on your own terms, on your own time. And then when you're excited to talk about it, you get to come and talk about it. I did a seminar on the wavelength. We did a reverse seminar where I talked about the Dave length, and I talked about how everybody has their own Dave length, right? The Sam length, the Spencer length. Everybody has their own wavelength, and then every friendship has its own wavelength. Every class has its wavelength, and you can loop people into the wavelength, but then it's easy to fall off the wavelength. And asynchronous simultaneity is a way of we're all kind of on this wavelength that we're accessing at different technical times, right? That's what I'm getting at with asynchronous simultaneity. What we did with TUCon was supposed to be an experiment in asynchronous simultaneity. We were all doing breakout rooms at the same time, but then we were going to live stream all of it and watch all of it, but it was too much. We created too much content. We weren't thinking realistically. We created 24 hours of content within just a few, like 5 or 6 hours. Like there was no way we could live stream all of that and watch all of that and actually process it all without burning out. And it would have undermined the socializing that we wanted to do, right? So it was a failure. TUCon was a failure in terms of trying to achieve asynchronous simultaneity. But, you know, lots of really cool stuff came from it. And there is a volume in the works that's going to be called Underground Theory TUCon never happened. And then we'll actually have a bunch of the works that came out of TUCon last October. So that's an announcement for people who are wondering if that was ever going to happen or if anything was going to come from that. It is definitely going to happen. And so, I'll be reaching out to you hopefully in the very near future if you are going to be in it. And if you didn't attend TUCon, but you want to reflect on this lecture and you have ideas about this, those could actually be included in that volume. And this is going to be a dope-ass volume. We've got Slavoj Žižek in it. We've got a bunch of other big-name people who are going to be in it, including Nina Power. Benjamin Studebaker's got some sick pieces that are going in there. I've got an amazing piece from Samuel Lonkar that's going in there. Nance has a bunch of epic pieces. So I think it's going to be a really, really sick volume. So definitely be thinking about that. We have this amazing piece by Will on the Agora that's going to be in there. But yeah, all right. I'm about to close this out and then we'll have a little discussion because I want to hear the programmers' thoughts, the immediate thoughts. But I want to keep the discussion separate from the lecture, which is a weird thing here at Theory Underground, and it's also new. But it will be available in the same playlist for everybody. The part I want to get real about, though, is how it's really easy to get off the wavelengths with somebody. When you're so used to everything being on call or on demand all the time, it becomes easy to use other people that way. And it becomes easy for other people to use you that way. It becomes easy for friends and family to only check in on you when they want something. It becomes easy for oh, hey, how are you doing and what's going on? And oh, that's interesting, but they're not really paying attention and they don't really mean it. And so they're not really checking in on you. They're not really trying to get looped in on your wavelength. They're just bored. They're distracted. They're just getting their dopamine hit. They're checking the box that says, yes, I socialize. They're checking the box that says, yes, I have family. Yes, I check in on family, but it's not deep. It's not real, right? So the threat or danger of favoring spontaneity and on-demand content is that we start to feel like we're part of something when we're not. We subscribe so that, it's like I subscribe to this one journal. Do I actually read it? No. But it's part of my identity, the fact that I subscribe to it, right? That's a danger. But I think it's danger all around. And all we can do is harness and counter these tendencies. So moving away from synchronic instantaneity most of the time, except for Zoom calls where people are discussing on-demand content, might be a way of strategically harnessing and countering some of these tendencies. And as far as the whole thing about the other person always being on call, I really played off of that in the lectures that I gave to my classes today and yesterday. And I used Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology, where at that moment that we consider ourselves masters and possessors over nature and have reduced nature to a bunch of resources to satisfy our appetites, what comes up behind our back, surprise, surprise, masters and possessors? No, because we've been reduced into human resources as well. That's why every institution you've ever lived your life through had a human resources department. You are human resources to this society for labor power, right? And the darkest part of that is that when he says that nature is on call for us, but now we're on call for the market, he wasn't thinking about people having smartphones in their bedrooms and being on call to the boss where they text you at midnight and say, actually, I need you to come in tomorrow on the weekend. Or where we're constantly on call to family and friends who, yeah, it'd be good to be able to be within reach if there's an emergency, but there's never emergencies, or people don't even talk when something really serious does come up. And instead we take each other for granted, and there's a complete collapse of these communicative channels where we start to take each other for granted. And now nobody's getting on the wavelength ever. And so these are the dangers and these are the stakes. And that's what I want you all to think about. And I hope that we could talk about it soon.